Vande! Vande! Modi! Modi ji! Thank you, ji, Modi.
Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi paid a short visit to USA to discuss global well-being and to coalesce ideas with USA and India to generate solutions to cryptic world issues. PM Modi spent his first 2 days of his 3-day visit to USA in Washington, D.C., where he took part in the Quad Leaders Summit. PM Modi's trip to the US included bilateral meetings with US President Joe Biden, multilateral meeting with Quad leaders, and he also held discussions with US Vice President Kamala Harris and the CEOs of some international companies. Foreign Secretary Harsh Vardhan Shringla met Minister Lord Tariq Ahmed of the UK Foreign Office at New York in the margins of UNGA for a discussion on issues including situation in Afghanistan. On his third day in USA, PM Modi visited United Nations to address the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly called UNGA, where he discussed global burning issues such as the global pandemic, COVID-19 disease, vaccination and vaccine research. PM Modi also rendered strong messages in UNGA on to how to combat global terrorism, create world peace via United Nations. PM Modi also laid emphasis on topics like integral humanism, expansion of self, equitable development, tech solutions that India can offer, India's vaccine delivery platform, COVIN, technology with democratic values, and gave a warm invite to UNGA by quoting, "Come make vaccine in India." PM Modi in UNGA as well elucidated how to circumvent global climate crisis and how to eradicate global terrorism.
Prior to his address, the Prime Minister was greeted by the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Abdullah Shahid. You would recall that the President of the General Assembly visited India on the 21st of August, on the 24th of July, and he had at that time called on the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, when he met the President of the General Assembly after he assumed office, he has just assumed office recently, congratulated him on his presidency of hope. The message of the Prime Minister was very well received, his congratulatory message, and I am told that there was very positive resonance on this concept of the presidency of hope. You are aware that the Prime Minister's address at the General Assembly marks the culmination of a very successful, a very comprehensive tour of the United States. The Prime Minister was in Washington, D.C., where he held a bilateral meeting with the US President, President Joe Biden. He also met Vice President Kamala Harris. He participated in the meeting of the Quad Leaders Summit, which was attended by the Prime Ministers of Japan and Australia, hosted by the President of the United States. And he also separately had meetings with his counterparts from Japan and Australia. In Washington, he met a number of CEOs of major US corporates. So all in all, it has been a short but very, very comprehensive, very useful visit, which allowed for extensive high-level interactions. His address in the United Nations, which you would have heard, has focused on some important themes. The first theme, of course, was that democracies can deliver, democracies have delivered. The Prime Minister spoke about an array of flagship programs and initiatives in India that have delivered very successfully to hundreds of millions of our citizens, whether it is in the aspect of enabling them to enter into the banking sector by allowing people to open bank accounts, whether it is in terms of participating in health schemes that provide for quality health services to a very large number of our people, health insurance, low-cost housing for millions of our citizens, being converted from landless to landowners, as the Prime Minister said. Also, very strong emphasis that the Prime Minister laid on this issue of technology. Technology has delivered for us. We have used technology in very many areas of our developmental activity that has enabled us to reach out to people in all parts of the country every segment of society. And that, I think, has been a very important message that has been conveyed. He also drew the analogy of our efforts in the health sector. Health is an overriding priority, obviously, in the general discourse in the United Nations at this point of time. The Prime Minister spoke about our use of technology in the health sector, especially with regard to the ability to immunize hundreds of millions of our citizens in the COVID-19, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, through the CoWIN platform, which is one of the finest, most, I would say, well-conceived digital platforms. You would recall that when CoWIN was introduced to the international community through the CoWIN Global Conclave, 142 countries participated. It has been put as an open source digital platform available to countries around the world. The Prime Minister also spoke about the success of our vaccination program. 800 million plus of our citizens have already received vaccination doses. We are looking at accelerating this, and the Prime Minister emphasized the fact that the success of this entire enterprise was also based on the organizational aspect of it, including CoWIN, of course. And of course, the fact that we have today come out with cutting-edge technologies. We have our indigenous vaccines. We also have developed a DNA vaccine, which will be introduced for children, which is a touch vaccine. We have come up with mRNA technology. So we are also at the cutting edge of vaccine development. And Prime Minister referred to India as a manufacturing hub for vaccines for the entire world. In that context, of course, he spoke of the fact that we had announced our decision to again recommence exports of vaccines from month of October. Again, this is extremely well received in the UN and the international community. The Prime Minister spoke of global value chains in the context of Atmanirbhar Bharat, resilient supply chains that we are developing. Important emphasis was given on climate change, in which the Prime Minister pointed out that we ourselves had unilaterally gone in for a 450 gigawatt target by 2030. We were ahead in terms of meeting our expectations in the Paris Agreement, and that if we were to look at the gains that we would make in addressing the issue of climate change, it is because we have to answer to future generations. And the Prime Minister pointed out that it was important for us to ensure that we do the right thing now, so that our future generations don't question the fact that we hadn't done enough to make our planet both sustainable environmentally and something that is enduring. I think, again, when you talk about technology, the Prime Minister talked about science-based rational thinking applied to development. I think that is an important factor, that science and technology have dictated how we can best provide our development gains to as many of our people as possible, as effectively and as cost effectively as possible also. And he also talked about, from that point of view, the development of incubators, a startup culture, the importance and promise of innovation among the youth of India, the development of satellites, 75 satellites to commemorate our 75th anniversary of independence. On international issues, you would have noticed that the Prime Minister referred to the most pressing issue of today again, which is the topic of conversation of almost every head of state and government that has spoken at the United Nations, the situation in Afghanistan. He said that countries using terrorism as a tool should note that this is a double-edged sword. I think that's a very important point to make, that you cannot think of encouragement to terrorism, because that can come back to bite you. In the context of Afghanistan, the Prime Minister referred to the fact that the plight of women, children, minorities should not be forgotten, that these basic human rights of people of Afghanistan are important. They need the help of the international community, and it was incumbent on the international community to come forward to speak in one voice on some of these issues that are important to all of us. the Prime Minister did speak about the fact that we shouldn't abuse our natural resources. This is a legacy for the future. This is a trusteeship of nature that has been bestowed on us, that our culture does. Indian culture and ethos is one that is close to nature, that we live in harmony with nature, and that is something that's important in today's context of dealing with climate change, dealing with some of the environmental issues that we face globally. He also spoke about the UN Security Council, in particular our contribution to the issue of maritime security in the UN Security Council. As you know, we were held the presidency of the Security Council, a very successful presidency. Our permanent representative has to take a great amount of that credit for a presidency that outlined and shaped thinking in many new areas. The highlight of which was the Prime Minister's chairing the open debate of the Security Council on the issue of maritime security. This is the first time an Indian Prime Minister has chaired a meeting of the UN Security Council. It's also the first time India has, or any country for that matter, has successfully steered a UN Security Council debate on the issue of maritime security and come up with an outcome document which today is being referred to by many countries as being the guiding, I would say, principles on this issue. We also, of course, focused on the issue of technology and peacekeeping, the important issue of counterterrorism, and in that context, of course, when we talk about international issues that are important to the global community, the Prime Minister referred to the COVID-19 and its origins, the case of the ease of doing business. I think that's important when we talk about the need for greater investment and technology flows. The issue of good governance. He called upon the UN to provide global order, global law, and global values. I think if you look at the statement, one or two things become apparent. The first, of course, is that India, by its own developmental paradigm and the success of its developmental efforts, is really, in many senses, providing development to the entire world, because we represent 1/6 of humanity. Our development, our progress, our success is the world's success. The second, of course, is the intention to share with the international community our best practices, our experiences, and in that context, the Prime Minister referred to the global common good and the fact that India has always looked to seeing how we could both support and assist the larger global community in whatever we do. And in that context, of course, technology and other issues were important in terms of focus. And of course, when we talk about development, then we talk about several models of development. I did give you some examples in terms of COVID, in terms of vaccine development that can also be successfully shared with the rest of the world. And that, I think, was the larger theme of what we spoke about. Of course, the PM's address helped us to project our long-standing growing credentials as a South-South development partner in the context of the India-UN Development Partnership Fund. Here again, I think important steps have been taken to see how we can work with the UN in an outreach that would enable some of our developmental successes and models that we have evolved within our country to be shared as effective and cost-effective practices that can be adopted elsewhere in the world. Financing for development, our commitment to the idea of global partnership under SDG 17, including on climate change. And of course, a number of countries in their addresses have referred to India, in particular our development partners in the context of COVID-19 assistance, in the context of development programs, and we thank them, we appreciate their sentiment, and we continue to look forward to a very close partnership with countries all over the world in the furthering in the extension of what we are doing within our own country. I think you drew attention to women and children and what can be done by the international community. You saw that in the Prime Minister's address to the UN just a short while ago. He laid very strong emphasis on the international community speaking out in one voice and also taking responsibility for a number of issues, but he mentioned in particular the issue of the human rights of women, children, minorities. I think that is an important issue from our perspective. It is an important issue from the perspective of the international community. If you look at what the international community is demanding of the ruling dispensation in Afghanistan, and I think that was the second part of your question, it is encapsulated in Resolution 2593 of the UN Security Council, which incidentally was adopted under our presidency of the Council. Resolution 2593 demands that Afghanistan's territory not be used for terrorism to the detriment of any of its neighbors or any other country. It also enjoins on them to respect the human rights of women, children, and minorities. It asks for unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance. And it also, I think, asks that there should be an inclusive, negotiated political settlement. These are the basic, I would say, requirements of the international community. Until and unless those requirements are met in part or in full, I think the international community will continue to wait and watch the situation. For the international community, this is an important area of fulfillment. Certainly, India will work with its partners, both regional partners and global partners, in ensuring that many of these important aspects, including, the evacuation of Afghan nationals who want to leave the country, are fulfilled. These are very important requirements, and these are also, in some senses, commitments that the ruling dispensation had made when they first entered Kabul, and we would like to see that those obligations and commitments being fulfilled. Yoshita, I think you had a similar question. I think I've basically answered what you were talking about. Certainly, within the Quad, there was a strong sentiment. You would have seen it in the joint statement that the Quad has issued, that Afghanistan is a high priority, that many of the elements that I mentioned in Resolution 2593 are reflected in the joint statement. This is, in some senses, a fairly accurate a description of the conversation that took place among the leaders of the Quad group. And I think unity when it comes to Afghanistan is very, very pertinent, and I think all the Quad leaders recognized that our interests converged and our interests were really reflected in the points that I made earlier. And from that point of view, I think the Quad was it was a very useful meeting in putting together the thinking and the objectives that the Quad leaders had in Afghanistan, bringing them on the same page. You spoke about Pakistan's support for terrorism. Again, you would have seen that in all the meetings the Prime Minister had, beginning with US leadership, there was suo motu recognition of the concerns that Pakistan represents as a country that has, in many senses, both supported and nurtured cross-border terrorism, including in Afghanistan and from Afghanistan. There was a sense that that situation needs to be watched very carefully, and that the international community needs to ensure that Pakistan fulfills its obligation as a member of the Committee of Nations in its basic obligations, that it does not in any way work against the detriment of its neighbors or any other country in the world. And that again has been reflected if you see strong statements both in the bilateral joint statement as well as the joint statement of the quadrilateral leaders summit, reflects those sentiments quite significantly. A rules-based order, yes, that was a recurring theme. The Quad stands for a rules-based international order. The Quad stands for a free, open, transparent, inclusive, prosperous Indo-Pacific region. And in that context, the right to freedom of navigation, use of global commons, international order is definitely there. This is a general sentiment, is a general principle. I would not say that it's directed to any country in particular. We believed in principles, we believe in values, and we believe that the Quad as a group must work with its Indo-Pacific partners, with ASEAN at its centrality to achieve those objectives.
I thank you all for your participation today morning. Appreciate. Good day.
Thank you very much. My name is Lenka White. I'm from the Mainichi newspaper and I cover the United Nations. I wanted to ask on Afghanistan. According to you, what are the next steps if Taliban will not have an inclusive government and when they should be taken? And second question, you spoke about women and children, that their rights need to be protected. How do you think we can ensure that? Thank you very much.
In his bilateral meetings with the president and also with Japan and Australia, did the Prime Minister highlight the need for unity in dealing with the Taliban situation in Afghanistan, given that we've seen there are divisions in the Security Council, whether it's from Russia or China, on how the situation should be dealt with, and also to ensure that the Afghan soil is not used as a terror launchpad for in the region? Thank you.
What kind of assurances India gets from the bilaterals from US when it comes to Pakistan support to terror and China as an aggressor during this entire 3-day visit?
Sir, Maha Siddiqui from CNN News 18. Sir, the G4 countries recently released a statement once again asking for the need of UN reforms. What is the biggest hurdle in the reforms, sir? Why isn't it happening despite the fact that the UN fails to represent realities of the modern world?
The Prime Minister mentioned in his speech about a rule-based order. Quite clearly that would be seen as an indication to China's aggressive behavior. Would you subscribe to that?
So, Reena Bhardwaj from ANI. Now, President Biden did discuss with Prime Minister Modi that India should have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Was there any similar sentiment that India gathered through the meetings or throughout this week at Anga?
Whether the UN has failed to fulfill its obligations. The United Nations, of course, continues to be a body that represents the legal and de jure interests of countries from all over the world and its membership. It is, the forum in which countries can come to seek both a projection of their, let's say, larger global engagements, but also to resolve many of the issues that are pertinent to them. In many cases, we have seen that the UN has not lived up to its commitments, whether it is in the area of international peace and security, whether it's in the area of healthcare, epidemics and pandemics. And I think in all of these, there is obviously a need to look at how we can reform the UN in general and the UN Security Council in particular. Reformed multilateralism has been India's main theme, and we will continue to work towards the reformed United Nations during our stint as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's also interesting to note that many other countries also share our sentiments. We have a very large measure of support. You heard President Biden when he said, President Biden, this is not public messaging, but he did mention that India should have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. I think that is reflected in the joint statement, and this is something that continues to be a view held by not just the US but other Quad partners and many other countries. In the UNGA debate this time, you would have seen that after the United States, in President Biden's statement, mentioned this factor, but there was also Portugal that supported India for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. A permanent seat as well as reform of the UN Security Council remains India's top priority, as I mentioned. There is a sense that under the new President of the General Assembly, there would be a thrust to the process, the intergovernmental process, and we will move forward to text-based negotiations, which we have been talking about, with concrete outcomes in a fixed time frame. We believe that India's 75th anniversary coincides with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. This is the time that the UN should fulfill its long-standing obligations to reform for the benefit of the global community.